finally, an indentured servant, remember the situation for indentured servants, not good even once they get their freedom, if they make it to freedom, by the way, which most of them did not, particularly in the early years. They live on the outskirts of society. They're given the worst land. They're closest to Native Americans, which leaves them susceptible to attack. Jamestown is dominated by the wealthy planters in the middle, and they're going to make decisions that are beneficial to them. So they tend to not really do much with the defenses on the outskirts. And Bacon gets annoyed after a Native American situation, and he attacks the Native Americans. But that's not what it's really about. It's really more about their social situation being in the bottom of the society. By the way, this is like 1675. When the governor says, don't do that, he then attacks Jamestown. Eventually, he dies, I think, of a disease or something like that on the warpath, basically. But it's very symbolic of the social tension within society. And remember, the natural thing that sort of eases these tensions over time, there's not like a snap of the fingers and let's get rid of these tensions. You've got the slavery kind of comes into play here. Now these indentured servants, once they're free, they're going to be able to be hired as overseers and that sort of thing, instead of being sort of stuck out in the poor land in the outskirts. That is kind of a big deal there. Anything else that we're forgetting? Virginia, Chesapeake area? We have two other quick spots. How about the middle? New York, Pennsylvania, and New Jersey. The early colonists came, and William Penn came in, and he stumbled across the New Jersey Turnpike in 1689. I'm just kidding. And he was like, dang it, this is a terrible exit to be on. Anyway, so William Penn, obviously a big name. And obviously that's Pennsylvania. But New York, obviously part of this whole thing as well. The name of the game for the middle colonies, I don't know why I put William Penn first, because that's not really the first thing that should come to your mind. What comes to your mind when you think middle? One word. Erica? Diversity. Diversity. And the breadbasket is part of that diversity because there is economic diversity. Really good farmland, sort of the best of the North and the South. You've got, remember the South also, you can put this back onto your Chesapeake area, obviously diseases and low life expectancies for a while, malaria, all that kind of stuff, not so good. But you've got good farming, the breadbasket of the colonies, wheat and corn, etc. And you've also got fur trading, particularly up the Hudson. And then you've also got trade, and you've got the big cities, like eventually Philadelphia and New York City. Two of the bigger cities of the New World for their eventually big, capital cities and whatnot there. So the economic, obviously, advantages of that. You also have ethnic diversity, and this is probably the start of it all, because remember, the Swedes were there. They didn't leave. They just sort of got ingrained into the society, as did the Dutch. So you have the Dutch, the Swedes, you've got English, and of course the big cities sort of attract a cornucopia of people to come there. And a nice little diverse group there, particularly in the cities of the middle. And of course this leads to your final, your religious diversity. Obviously this ethnic diversity potentially will have some religious diversity that comes along with it, but the big thing is that first name up here. William Penn and the Quakers sort of had a social, what's the word I'm looking for? Religious tolerance associated with it. Yeah. So keep in mind, still, it's not all roses here in the middle colonies. It is pretty dominated by the upper class. The Quakers sort of dominate Pennsylvania. There were a group of proprietors. Quakers were mostly, Pennsylvania was dominated by proprietors as well, but these proprietors kind of controlled vast territories, and kind of was more like almost an attempt at feudalism in the New World for a while with, you know, up the Hudson you had all these big families that owned vast areas and they rented it out to people and that sort of thing. So, and yeah, I think pretty good stuff there. Good life expectancies here. Generally the situation is good. Finally, your south. We have two areas of the South to look at. First off, we have the coastal, which is dominated by, yeah, big plantations, like a cash crop kind of system. There are various cash crops, like in North Carolina you'd have like tobacco, but the big one is probably rice, particularly in South Carolina along the coast there. And a very similar, this has a very similar makeup to like the Chesapeake areas. Where you have these big plantations. Obviously slavery and low life expectancies, malaria in the early goings. Chesapeake and Southern, remember, early goings also very high male to female ratios, and that's going to stabilize out around 1700 or so. So that's pretty similar. And then you have the, anybody remember the other spot? The Piedmont. I have a fond affection for the Piedmont because the esteemed and awesome, by the way, ranked just rated #1 in teaching at the collegiate level, Davidson. It is in Charlotte, North Carolina, right on North Carolina's Piedmont area. And there's a great deal more of like small farmers and people sort of hacking it out of the wilderness there. Frontiersman type society there, which is, by the way, not Davidson at all. And so a lot of independence, really. And that, I think that's a pretty good description there. We forgot a couple of things. Don't forget about New England. You also had some dissenters as well. Who are your big dissenters? What'd you say? Oh, Anne, yeah. Anne who? Anne Hutchinson. Who believed that there was an issue here with the devotedness of the clergy, and she thought it's not really women's rights. It's more like she just thought that she should be allowed to become a saint because half the saints weren't nearly as devoted as she was. She's of course sort of shipped out there. The other person that's shipped out or kind of voluntarily leaves is Roger the Dodger Williams. He heads off to Rhode Island. Remember, it is separation of church and state, not necessarily religious tolerance, although there is a little bit of that. The separation of church and state is his big thing there. He felt that Massachusetts Bay and Plymouth were becoming more like theocracies, and he didn't necessarily agree with that. He saw some weakness within that. So he kind of moved on there. All right. Remember the other sort of thing, the other impact in England that's having some impact in the colonies, the colonial regions would be, it is a generation of war going on in England. Remember the English Civil War is sort of erupted in the mid-1600s. And there's kind of a back and forth. There's the Restoration, 1660, and that lasts till 1688 when William and Mary come in, and that's why the college. And then they're going to have the Glorious Revolution. You don't necessarily need to know all those details of all those things, except for the impact on the colonies. And what's the big impact? The famous catchphrase, they are left to their own devices to form salutary neglect. Very good. And this is going to sort of cause an expectation of things here. Remember, the colonies are left to govern themselves. They have colonial legislatures and a royal governor, which are balancing one another out for the whole, all the way through the 1600s and most of the way into the 1700s as well. And they are governing themselves in day-to-day operations. They are responsible for everything except for two things. They are? What are the British responsible for in terms of governing? Protection, so defense, and regulating trade. And the method by which they regulate trade in the colonial region, well, there's two sort of big things. They use the system is known as mercantilism, where the idea, it's sort of two ideas off mercantilism. Number one is to create self-sufficiency within the empire, so that you don't really have to go outside of the empire at all to get anything that you need. So that's one aspect. The other aspect here is the process by which you have your colonies give you your natural resources. Those get shipped back to England, which is in the throes, the roots and the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution at this point. They then make a finished product out of it, and they sell back to, well, to themselves and to the rest, and to all of their colonies. So this is an important process. And the colonies are part of that process, and that's a good thing. They gain a high degree of wealth from that process. The system that is put in place, the series of laws that are put in place to embrace this concept of mercantilism, does anybody remember? You can do it by the stars. The Navigation Acts, that's the most convoluted hint I've ever given, and you saw right, that's a good job. You have the Navigation Acts, and remember, these are not necessarily, there were some colonists that grumbled about some of these acts, but there are a series of acts that are put in place over time, I think over the span of like 30 or 40 years, even longer than that, 75 years really or so. And remember, it limited imperial trade to British ships. Good or bad? Why is it good? Who's considered British? Colonists are British, so ownership and crew had to be 3/4 British, and that both of these factors lead to the development of the shipping industry, and particularly in New England, and in sort of like New York in that area. So it actually builds up the American merchant marine, and in fact by 1750, a third of imperial vessels will be American. So this is a very good for the United States. It barred the export of certain goods to foreign nations unless they passed through England or Scotland, and they were also sort of given, there was sort of a tax that sort of happened. And in exchange, though, again, benefiting the colonies, tobacco and rice were given monopoly within the British Empire to the American colonies. So the only rice and tobacco that could be used in the British, sold in the British Empire, were the colonial tobacco and colonial rice. So that is very good. And they also refunded a lot of the duties for those two in particular. There's that. There were bounties given as part of the acts to shortage areas like silk dyes, iron, hemp, lumber, all of these things, a couple of which were very plentiful in the New World, so that was good for the economic diversification. It did forbid Americans from competing with British manufacturers, but that's a little bit of a loaded term because it only banned large-scale manufacturing, number one, which the colonies didn't have any of that anyway, and the Americans weren't going to be able to compete with the British as it was, so it doesn't really matter. And there were a couple of exemptions, most notably iron, which was a kind of good, again, for the colonists there. So that is a major factor here. And obviously there are going to be some tensions moving forward with these. But all this for the colonies means very profitability. It's a very prosperous area. In fact, the standard of living is higher, even in the worst parts of America, than in the best parts of the British Isles, basically. So they are living large.